Okay, well, thanks for coming, everybody. Welcome to another Coffee and Politics event on behalf of the Foley Institute. We're pleased to be able to offer this in conjunction with the English department, who their visiting writers program brought Professor Miles out here today for the topic of political Islam. We try to have as many on-topic, hot topic issues as possible at these events. If you don't already receive our emails, there is a sign-in sheet in the kitchen there if you get yourself another slice of pizza at the end of this event. We will be ending pretty promptly at 1 o'clock, so I'd appreciate it if everyone stays until the end. Professor Miles will be talking for a while, and then there'll be a question and answer session. At that point, this microphone is going to come around as well, brought around by this lovely person here. So if you wait to speak into the microphone, that way it's captured on film for KWSU. So at this moment, though, apart from me thanking you for coming here, I'd like to pass this over to Peter Chilson, who will introduce Professor Miles. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to extend my thanks once again to the Foley Institute for helping fund Professor Miles' visit and also helping bring along Sam Miles. These two gentlemen, father and son, co-wrote a memoir, My African Horse Problem, which is a wonderful title. I first became aware of William Miles about 15 years ago when I became, we both share a background in West Africa. We were both Peace Corps volunteers in Niger. And I've written a couple of books about West Africa. I actually run the creative writing program over at the Department of English, and my work in Africa is in fiction and creative nonfiction. And 15 years or so ago, Professor Miles wrote a brilliant book called House of Land Divided, which is about the colonial border between the border between the former French colony of Niger and former British Nigeria. And that book and some other experiences I had helped develop my own interest in studying border issues in West Africa. Professor Miles is a professor at Northeastern University in Boston. And he's an authority on border issues, particularly in West Africa, but also around the world. He does work in Israel as well. He's an author of eight or nine books, including these two books here, is his book with his son Sam, and books on political Islam. With all that said, I'll hand it over to Professor Miles, and thanks very much.
Thank you, Peter, very much, and thank you, Richard. Thanks to the Foley Center. Thanks for coming out this afternoon. Thanks to my son for accompanying his dad cross country. I don't think we've ever done such a thing before. And allowing us to share our respective takes on life in a part of the world that is little known in America, that being Africa. You know, I have to warn you that my framing of our conversation, and that's how I see it, our conversation about political Islam is going to be a bit schizophrenic. First, I'm going to read a 6-minute version of a commentary that I recorded the day before yesterday for National Public Radio. It's going to be broadcast on October 27th with my local NPR affiliate. It's not as good as the one about the hat that I've already been asked for, but I can provide links to that story as well. They have a series called This I Believe. And what I'm going to read is, again, a 6-minute version of what I'm telling them I believe in the context of Islam, Africa, and life as a former Peace Corps volunteer, which one is always a former Peace Corps volunteer at heart. And the title of it is Requiem for My Muslim Chief, or an unorthodox Kaddish. Haven't decided which one it will be. So then after I do the reading, I'm going to shift gears and then approach the same topic in my capacity as a counterterrorism consultant for the US government. Okay, so think of the reading first as that of an unreconstructed former Peace Corps volunteer, and part two as an exercise in hard-nosed political analysis. This morning, I learned that my chief, an African chief of a Muslim people, died. And while some of my Orthodox co-religionists may frown upon the idea, tonight I shall say Kaddish in his honor. For he was not only my chief, he was the very embodiment of peace, tolerance, and humanity to which every leader should strive and for which every religious person should pray. Precisely half my life ago, 27 years before, to be exact, I first appeared before El-Haji Haru Sarkin Fulane Maigari da Mai Gundabana Yardaji Zangonda Ora. At the time, I had no idea what all those titles meant, only that he was the one who presided over the village in which I was hoping to live. Together, I eventually learned, those honorifics conveyed that he had already undertaken the proscribed pilgrimage to Mecca, that he was the chief not only over my desired village, but over the surrounding territory, and that he was a royal of the nomadic tribe credited with Islamizing the entire region by jihad 2 centuries ago. What the title does not convey is the country in which this was happening and the ethnic group among whom I would live as one of his subjects. The country, the strategic, oil-spouting giant about which we usually read only trouble, Nigeria, and the ethnic group, the same one out of which the would-be underwear bomber would later emerge, the would-be underwear bomber, a Hausa. By agreeing to host me in his community and never asking for a thing in return, El-Haji Haru became my chief. I've lost track of the number of times I returned to Yardaji in Nigeria's far Muslim north since that first year I spent there. At my most recent visit, last December, I was warned that the chief's vision was dimmed and his hearing greatly diminished. But he unfailingly asked after each individual member of my family, even remembering to ask about my mother and not my father, who had already died before my first coming to the chief's domain decades before. And, as was his custom, soon after my arrival, he gifted me some birds, sometimes doves, this time a chicken. Ikon Allah, power of God, and Hakafa, that's how it is. Along with his irrepressible chuckle were my chief's trademark expressions. Sai Hakuri, practice patience, was another oft-used phrase of his, especially when administering justice or reconciling quarreling couples. And, as in all Hausa speech, he would rarely go 3 sentences without invoking Lafia, peace, well-being. An Orthodox Muslim, one would be hard-pressed to describe my chief as a progressive. He had 4 wives simultaneously, and more children than even he could probably keep track of. But not only did he approve of my mother's and aunt's funding of a shelter for blind women in his village, it was he who provided the precious plot of land right in the middle, just across from his own royal compound. In all those years, our personal relations were tested only once. While I was away on safari hosting a visiting friend from the Bronx, someone broke into my hut and stole my only source of information from the outside world, shortwave radio. It was the chief who paid for the town crier to announce that he would have a Quranic curse cast upon the culprit if the radio were not returned. It was returned, but I also wanted the thief to be punished. But the chief never let on that he knew what the entire village, including myself, also knew, that it was a younger, favorite son of his who had committed the burglary. My courtesy visits to him were difficult for me in those days, but I did learn to practice patience. Over more time, a quarter of a century's worth, I also learned from my Muslim chief the greatness of leadership through hospitality, generosity, and religious tolerance. And when I happened to be back in Yardaji 3 months after 9/11, in extending condolences over what had happened to my brothers, my chief reaffirmed the greatness of faith and compassion over tribalism and fanaticism. I grew up less than 20 miles from the World Trade Center. Why do those from afar who so fervently oppose a Muslim community center near its site so adamantly strive to associate Islam with the face of bin Laden? Why this urge to fear and reject a religion represented the world over, rather by people like my chief, El Haji Haru? Yes, I will say Kaddish for my departed Muslim chief. And in his honor, I shall add in Hebrew, as do many Jews, to the prayer's affirmation that the Holy One will bring peace over all of the people of Israel, the words, Ve'al kol yoshvei tevel, and over all the dwellers of this world. And, as they say in Hausaland, Amin. So, now, with Sam's help, let me square that NPR Peace Corps perspective with this. Just one of the bin Laden memorabilia, which I picked up, and you can still pick up in the, I think the other one has the English version, Sam, which in the same part of West Africa that I just read you about. Now, and some of it is obviously just Photoshop put up and stuff. And I'm not saying or trying to show by these posters that Al-Qaeda is uniformly supported in Nigeria or even in the Muslim part of Nigeria. But it's hard to ignore these kinds of artifacts. They also come in handy when I'm asked to consult on certain topics, such as political Islam in Africa, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. That's the name of a terrorist group, Akim, that has recently struck again, even in Niger. I've been asked to consult on foreign perceptions of the US and also on AFRICOM, which is the Africa Command of the US Armed Forces with responsibility over Africa. So there are 9 political tendencies evolving with respect to Islam in Africa. And I'll just throw them out kind of as bullet points and pick up the thread as interests you. Now, 9 is an awkward number, you know? especially when you're trying to pretend for comprehensiveness. So I'm inviting you, in fact, I'm asking you, beseeching you to give me a nice rounding tenth, so that next time I'll be able to say that there are 10. So what are the 9 political tendencies regarding Islam that I've been very sensitive to? The first is the challenge mounted against Sufi style. Sufi is mystical Islam, the type of Africanized Islam prevalent in West Africa and across the board to a very large extent. There's a challenge mounted against Sufi style African Islam by a so-called reformist or orthodox style of Islam in Africa. Let me just say that Sufi Islam in Africa is a mix, is a hybrid of African practices with Islamic beliefs. African cultural practices and a gradually assimilated African Islamic system of prayer and religion. So let me give you some examples. The notion of spirit possession, which is part of African culture but not Islamic. Bori, as it's called. This is one of the things that Orthodox modernizing Muslims now are saying, let's get rid of that. Or amulets, the wearing of pieces of the Quran written out and then folded or sewn into leather and worn to protect you against disease or even bullets being shot at you. Those are expensive ones. Or the drinking of holy ink from the Quran after you wipe off words from study tablets. Or music and drumming, very African part of the culture, venerating saints, Muslim saints. All of these aspects of Sufi Islam are under attack by these orthodox, you've heard the term perhaps Wahhabi, inspired Muslims who've gone to Saudi Arabia or have come back from elsewhere in the Arabic world and say and look back at their African Islam and they say, hey, you know, this is superstitious. This is old-fashioned. This is not the Islam of today. This is this is one of the tensions that is very important to understand in terms of life in Muslim Africa. The second, democratization as a means to strengthen or extend Islam. Now, it sounds counterintuitive, perhaps, but around 1990, with the collapse of the Cold War being over, the Berlin Wall, so Africa, which had been politically associated with military dictatorships, authoritarian rule, one-party regimes, there was an opening up. And with the Soviet Union no longer as a model, US and democracy was the only alternative. And so as these countries started to open up as well and say, we too can be progressive and democratic, the notion of civil society, that is spaces within the country that are not going to be controlled by government, freedom of people to associate on the basis of whatever basis they wanted to associate, including religion, gave space for Islamic groups to start speaking out on issues other than pure religion. And so paradoxically, you had the rise of the influence of Muslim groups as a result of democratization. Islam was no longer going to be set up or dictated to by the governments. It was going to speak in its own name. Okay, so the third tendency, which I think is important to know, is that, and this is paradoxical given what I just said about Islam and democratization, is that there's a certain anti-Westernization that accompanies democratic Islam. Why this anti-Westernization? Well, you know, it's a very appropriate moment now, 2010, where many countries in Africa, Niger, Nigeria, most of them became independent in 1960. So this is the 50th anniversary. A lot of countries are celebrating their independence. And they're looking back and they're saying, what have we accomplished with this independence? Has it been a success? Has independence given us the level of prosperity, the social services, the freedom to be whom we want that decolonization was promising? And a lot of people are looking back and they're saying, no, there's been a failure. And the nation state, which is the bedrock belief for independence, this is not an answer. Independence has not given us what we really wanted. I mean, a lot of the countries we're talking about are ranked by the United Nations in their Human Development Index at the very bottom of the barrel. Niger, you know, we take this perverse pride in having such strong relations and writing about the country, which is consistently ranked last at the bottom of the United Nations Human Development Index rankings ever since the index was created. What success from independence? What is there to be proud of? You know, what kind of birthday party is this? And so it's the Western world that gave them the promise of independence through a nation state as providing answers, and it hasn't. And in the context of Islam, another part of this anti-Westernization coming up has to do with the offending social mores that they feel we are foisting upon that part of the world. What offending social mores? Well, to begin with, this notion of female empowerment. Okay, my chief, who took 4 wives, is very common. I mean, these wives were not co-equal members of the household. Okay, so the notion that is seen to come from the West, that women are equal and should have this equal say, both in the political and economic sphere, as well as the household, that rubs a lot of Muslims the wrong way. Now add to that gay rights in a culture in which homophobia, well, not homophobia, homosexuality is haram. It is a cardinal sin according to orthodox and traditional interpretations of Islam. And when they listen to Voice of America in the Hausa language or Swahili or in whatever African vernacular it's being translated into, they hear what's going on in the United States and how the gay rights movement is an important social force. They just don't understand. And not only that, they take offense that we are saying that we, the Western world, that in the name of universal human rights, gays as well as women should be given as much status, respect, and power as everybody else. You know, what is this Western world? Is the question that comes in reaction. So, the fourth tendency in Islam with political ramifications in Africa is the movement to upgrade, ratify, or otherwise extend Sharia, Islamic law, in place of secular Western-style jurisprudence. Most countries in Africa inherited either from Britain or from France or, heavens forbid, Portugal, I'm sorry to say that, a system of justice from colonial era, and they just extended it, continued it without any significant adaptation. And Muslims in Africa look at the judicial system that they've inherited and the countries have maintained, they say, this is broken. This is corrupt. And it is true that if you are brought to court, but you're a big man, you pay your way, you bribe your way out of court. That there is no justice, they say, according to the Western style system of justice that has been inherited, or trials that go on for decades with no resolution. Why not, they say, go back to a system of justice that we have for many years, Sharia law, Islamic law. It's expeditious, doesn't have all these legal technicalities. We can go to the heart of justice, and we know that this is the kind of justice that God wants, because this is God's law. So you have places like Sudan, the largest geographical country in Africa, or Nigeria, the largest populated country in all of Africa, which have adopted, in parts of the country at least, Sharia as the law of the land to replace inherited British style jurisprudence. That's an important trend as well. Fifth, and this is related, when you upgrade Sharia Islamic law in countries that have significant populations of Christians, no matter how many guarantees you give by saying Sharia is only going to apply to Muslims or only be used between Muslims and Christians when both sides are in agreement, Christians are going to be concerned and anxious and feel discriminated against. And Sharia is going to stoke tensions between Muslim and Christian communities. And the kinds of riots that break out in Nigeria, for instance, periodically, that did not exist even 30 years ago, much less 50 years ago, when independence came, are becoming more and more common. And part of it comes from this Sharia issue. It also comes from fundamentalist preaching, Christian fundamentalist and Muslim fundamentalist. So sixth development, millenarian or cultist Islamist-tinged movements. You know, we think Waco, Texas, and the Branch Davidians, but in a Muslim idiom. Those kinds of movements which believe that the end of the world is upon us, that they are being pressured by their government, by society, by the world, that they've got to withdraw and create what they consider a utopia, we consider a dystopia. That also is popping up throughout parts of Muslim Africa. And the most recent is a group called Boko Haram, which means literally means Western style education is un-Islamic. And they say the most corrupting force in our society today is the schools that we send kids to. That is a troubling tendency as well. Seventh, which I've actually touched upon, gender struggles. The place of women in an evolving African Islam. Okay? The fact that a woman like Amina Lawal will be known worldwide. Who is Amina Lawal? Amina Lawal was the first woman in Nigeria prosecuted under Sharia law for committing adultery and received the death penalty. And the proof of her crime was the baby. That was the outcome of the alleged adultery. Now, just to reassure everybody, the president of Nigeria stepped in and he said, no matter what the courts say, we will not allow the death penalty to be applied in such cases in our nation. That was respected, and she was not put to death. And eventually she was released under appeal in the Islamic court under the doctrine of the sleeping embryo. And her very clever lawyer made the point that according to Islamic law, they could not prove that that baby had not been conceived by her previous husband. Just a legal detail for the legal-minded people here. But my point is that issues regarding over women are now, in ways that unimaginable in 1960, when independence came, part of the Islamic discussion in Islamic Nigeria, Islamic Africa. Eighth, globalization of Islam. The notion that African Muslims really are part of a much wider Islamic world. Different models that they are choosing from, the Saudi model, which they're getting because they go to pilgrimage in Mecca, they live there. That's a very interesting way to be Muslim. Or the Iranian model, they get a scholarship, they spend 4 years in Tehran, site of the Muslim Revolution. Or they go to Cairo, or they go to Europe, they go to America, and they come back and they have different notions of the place of Muslims in other parts of the world. And the ninth concern in terms of that I look at as a political scientist, and of course the one that we hear about is jihadist Islam, that in Africa there have been acts of terrorism, the worst being the bombings of the US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998, the spillover from a group called Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, which kidnaps and has even assassinated a handful of Westerners in Mauritania, in Mali, and 2 weeks ago in Niger there was a kidnapping as well. And in Somalia, Al-Shabaab, an Islamic extremist group which is trying to overthrow the government. So, to round out my remarks in Hegelian terms, if I may be allowed, we've got thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. The thesis, which is buttressed by my personal experience in the first part, my reading, is that religious pluralism has been up to now and continues to be, I maintain, the norm in sub-Saharan Africa, including Muslim societies. The antithesis, which is what my clients, when I'm consulting, all they want to hear about is the conflict and the potential for violence. And the synthesis within me is trying to be faithful to myself as the idealistic Peace Corps volunteer that I once was and remains buried inside, and the political scientist that I'm paid to be. So help me with this personal dilemma between what I feel about Africa here, but what I read, as do you, about Africa and the evolution in terms of political Islam. And I thank you for letting me wrestle publicly with this dilemma, and hoping that your questions and comments and that 10th perhaps element will aid in my ongoing process to reconcile heart and head and experience.
So we have about 15 minutes for questions. I can start off with a question. Just a week ago on National Public Radio, I heard a gentleman named Howard French, who's the former
New York Times correspondent for Africa.
And I think he was bureau chief in both the West Africa Bureau and in East Africa. He spent quite a while there. And he said, now he's a professor, I believe, at Columbia University, I'm not sure, but he said that in the next 50 years or so, one of the things that we're going to see, one of the big changes we're going to see in Africa, and this gets back to a little bit of what you were talking about in terms of the problems of the African nation state, is the dissolution of some of Africa's borders and the emergence of some African super states. And so I was wondering if you could comment on that. Do you think he's got a right to predict that kind of thing? Or
I think he's right on the first and wrong on the second. We're going to have the first dissolution of an African border in July, most probably. There have only been 2 cases of African borders being dissolved since independence. One that's happened and one that's going to happen. And before I give you the examples, and you're either thinking or fervently Googling to figure out what they are. At independence, the Organization of African Unity, as it was then called, decided that however ridiculous were the lines separating peoples in Africa inherited from colonialism, we're going to stick to them. Because dissolving boundaries and reconstituting the shapes of countries is going to be a nightmare and a worse problem than anything else. So except for the example of Eritrea, which at the time peaceably, but then not so peaceably, emerged out of Ethiopia, and the upcoming example of Sudan, where the South is going to be voting, or supposed to vote, in January, whether it's going to secede from the rest of Sudan, in which case you will have new boundaries there. The rest of Africa's borders have been relatively inviolate. The notion of a super African country taking more territory is going to be greatly resisted. Greatly resisted. And for a purely basic political and economic reason. You know, where is the money? The money is in government. If you want to succeed in Africa, you got to be part of the government. And if you've got 52 governments now, you multiply 52 by the number of people who can eat in government. If you reduce that number, there are a lot of people who have fewer opportunities to take advantage of the little wealth that is concentrated in Africa, which is through state services and taxes. So yes, some borders will disintegrate, and more governments will be constituted, but not the converse of that.
Go ahead. This gentleman had his hand up.
You talked about the Sharia in Africa. The Hadith does say that if you're non-Muslim, it can be left aside to their own faith's, basically judicial system to resolve issues. Do you think that there could be a Sharia law and a separate kind of generalized secular government side-by-side Sharia to deal with non-Muslims and have that work, or do you think people are still too paranoid?
Well, the first thing, and I'm glad that you asked that question, it enables me to say a very important point. There is no such thing as a Sharia law. Each country adopts a kind of Sharia law, so that it's a national specific one. And so that the kind of Sharia that you have in Nigeria is not the same as in Sudan, much less the same in Saudi Arabia or Iran. So there's a lot of diversity. And so therefore the possibilities of relationships between Sharia and the secular system of law is also infinite as well. There's talk of even adopting Sharia law in the United States. Now, what would that mean? It would mean that the courts would empower Muslims who are in agreement to settle their disputes according to Islamic law, rather than suing in the court of the federal court jurisdiction of Pullman. for instance. They talked about this in Britain, and a lot of people were very upset. Now, the way that Islamic law in that context would work itself out is very different than the way it would work itself out in Nigeria or elsewhere in Africa. The important thing to know is that there is creativity within law in the way of setting up laws and the way that people can bind themselves to the different systems as well. I mean, why? Look, if you've got a property dispute, for instance, about a mosque, do you really need to bring this to the civil courts? Perhaps it could be taken care of inside.
Oh, okay. As you can see, I'm probably the most senior citizen sitting here. I'm a retired University of Idaho department head for economics and director of international studies. Your first story reminds me of Greg Mortison's story in 3 Cups of Tea, when he met this elderly gentleman in the northern part of Pakistan and who saved his life. Some of you know it in 3 Cups of Tea. And this morning I was reading in the Evergreen the story about this Westboro church, Westboro community, where this young man who died in Afghanistan was at his funeral. There are some fundamentalist church people are screaming that he's dying because America is a sinful society and it allows homosexuality and all those things. So some of those strands of thought are emerging here in the Western society. And, there's a kind of a moral crisis going on in all directions. So all these 9 points that you mentioned, many of these issues are kind of common in all directions in the Islamic world. You didn't mention Malaysia and Indonesia, where also a student are getting more of a progressive perspective on Islam, rather than a Wahhabism kind of perspective. And finally, a comment as far as the Sharia law is concerned. I think there are some studies that I can cite you references in the law school journals. The Sharia law also was in part the foundation of the American Constitution under Jefferson. Jefferson learned Arabic to study Quran. Okay, and there are some articles I can cite you in the law school journals. The Sharia is no different from the canon law. Canon law is another word in Arabic, say Sharia law. Canon law was in the old days of medieval Christianity. And there's the Catholic law with respect to divorces and so forth, and there's the Jewish law with respect to so there is some parallels there in all the, except that the word Sharia has been presented as something enormously frightening and scary, and my God, go after these people. So I may have a 10th point for you, and that is, and I just encountered a book yesterday, it just came out, by Robert Pappy and James Feldman, University of Chicago. And they're reversing the whole argument. Is political Islam the cause or the effect? Think about that. Thank you.
Other questions?
Thank you. Professor Miles, I just wanted to dovetail on Peter's earlier question and ask you, how does one construct, given the problems that we have discussed, how does one construct a modern national state in Nigeria, for example, given the religious and ethnic cleavages in that country?
Nigeria is one. Now, that's an expression that politicians in Nigeria have been saying for decades. Nigeria did undergo a civil war very parallel to that we did, that really sundered the country into two. And this was in the 1960s, the War of Biafra, it was called. And they survived it, and as a nation. And the way that they did was to reconstruct, almost in a Lincolnian fashion, the notion that there will not be retribution against the former rebels, that we can go beyond the reasons that created the Civil War in the first place, to think of ourselves again as one nation. But you've got to have something behind the rhetoric. You've got to have something material behind the rhetoric. Something material in the world that I come from means development. It means to be able to provide services in health, in education, infrastructure, employment to the people, so that being Nigerian or being Sudanese is a reason not only of identity, it's not only providing identity, but it's providing a certain kind of opportunity and an outlet to be oneself. And that's why the United States, speaking from wearing a policy hat, really should be concerned with the fragile state of nation states in Africa, and use a small portion of our resources to assist benign and genuine efforts in those countries to provide for their citizens things that are necessary and crucial and critical. Because basically, the family of my chief and the families that I know, they want the same things that I want for Sam and his sister, which is a better life. And we never have to question here in this country whether having a United States of America is a good thing for the purposes of providing for our children. It's a given. But imagine living in a situation in which the very premise of having a country is not satisfying is not satisfying the need or the capacity to provide a future for your children. You're going to look for something else. Islam can provide that other thing, and it's important that we encourage efforts that Islam in Africa and in the Near East and elsewhere be able to provide those things in ways that are compatible with the nation states that are in existence, rather than saying we'll need to do away with those nation states and Islam to be defined by whom? By bin Laden or others who want to reconstruct the world according to the Ummah as they see it? No. So fortunately, there are things that we do as a international development assistant donor. And but the first step is to appreciate the challenges that these countries, such as the ones that we've talked about this afternoon, are facing. And that's why I'm glad that you've taken your time and decided to have only pizza for lunch, so that we could talk about these issues.
Well, it just remains to me to thank you on behalf of the Foley Institute and the Department of English for coming out today, and I'd like you to join me in thanking Professor Miles for a very good